All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is the first supply chain event we've had for, I think, about 2 years. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting here today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. Today we're on Darton Young country, and it's this site in particular is very special to that tribe. So good morning to everyone here and online. On behalf of the Hunter Central Coast Supply Chain Logistics Forum, I'd like to welcome you here today. So my name is Frank Samet. I'm the Executive Director of Central Coast Industry Connect. I went back and just had a look at some history for this forum. It's been going for quite a while, actually. It was initiated by Foresights back in May 2016 in collaboration with ourselves, CCIC, the New South Wales Government and On-Industries Entrepreneurs Program. And back then it was called the Central Coast Supply Chain Logistics Forum. And since then, it's expanded into the Hunter, and today I think we might be even going into Western Sydney. So we're starting to spread our reach, and clearly the hybrid event allows us to do that. So the reason why this forum was established was to provide an opportunity for logistics managers, providers, manufacturers and like-minded people in associated industries to share logistics challenges and confronting businesses today. And obviously, you know, we've got some major issues that occurred over the last couple of years, but you know, we've had supply chain issues for a number of years now. So the partners today in the forum, so is ourselves, Central Coast Industry Connect, Rare Kind, formerly Foresights, HunterNet and AI Group. I just want to acknowledge Scott Henshaw from Rare Kind, who's also Associate Director of CCIC, Sarah Silken, back there, Kyle, thanks Kyle Chapman, and there's a few others here from Rare Kind. Also want to have a special thanks to our co-host in the University of Newcastle and to Shandell here, who's doing the console work. To be able to do an event like this with good quality, you need good facilities, and it's great that we've been able to use these facilities today. So yeah, I'm really pleased with that. I will acknowledge that Rare Kind are a sponsor of CCIC, and I also wanted to acknowledge Kevin Newell from the NAB Bank, who are also a major sponsor of CCIC. So the session, how the session is going to work today, we're going to get a presentation from Tim. I've asked a couple of panelists to be a part of this today, so we'll do the presentation. We'll have a bit of a panel discussion where that'll include questions from the audience here and from the audience online. For the people online, if you would like to put your questions in the chat section, and I'll be able to see those here on my iPad. So we'll get started. I just want to introduce you to Tim McLean. Tim's the principal of TXM Solutions. He's one of Australia's most respected manufacturing supply chain practitioners and thinkers. He's had a 30-year career in manufacturing and various plant management roles in organisations such as Clarinet, Amcor, International Paper and PPG. Along the way, he developed and applied his expertise in lean thinking and continuous improvement, and that's how I've actually connected with Tim through that lean space. In 2004, Tim established TXM Lean Solutions to leverage his experience in lean manufacturing and supply chain. And over the past decade, Tim and his growing team at TXM have worked with hundreds of companies across 25 countries globally, with offices in Australia, New Zealand, China, Canada, UK, France, and USA. He's written 2 books, Grow Your Factory, Grow Your Profits, and the second is On Time and in Full. I suspect the second book's probably going to be very relevant for today's discussion. So look, he's a sought after speaker, and we're very fortunate to have him here today. So I'd like to welcome Tim to the stage.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I suppose we're all wrestling with supply chain issues in some way, some way or other. Thank you for the introduction, by the way, Frank. I don't think I need to add to that. So what I'm going to talk to you today about something that we've kind of discovered in the last 2 years, which is supply chain risk. It's always been there, but maybe we've been less focused on it than we should have been. So what we've experienced in the last 2 years is the biggest supply chain disruption without question since the Second World War. So nothing has really compared to COVID. We've had to experience and deal with situations we never imagined we'd have to deal with. And I'm just talking about supply chain, not all the other lockdowns and so forth we've dealt with. So what's going on with supply chains generally? And it's interesting when you think about military situation and the situation in Ukraine. A lot of the coverage has been around actually supply chain. And so about the difficulty that Russians are having with extended supply chains. And what's the word that's often used with extended supply chains? That's with V. Vulnerable. Russia's extended supply chains are vulnerable. They're struggling with their logistics. Now, really, that's a good analogy for what goes on in civilian supply chains as well. And beginning of COVID, I read a study that was done before COVID, or probably around the same time as COVID, by McKinsey, who actually put together some good research. And what they found surveying global supply chain managers all around the world was that on average, they were reporting a major disruptive event that disrupted operations for at least a month every 3.7 years. So less than every 4 years was what was being reported. Now that's not possible, is it? We couldn't be having a major disruptive event. You know, COVID's a one-off, could we? No, we wouldn't have a major disruptive event. Oh, 2001, we had the World Trade Center. That was pretty disruptive, shut down air travel around the world. 2003, SARS. Those of you can remember it. Basically, there was no travel to North Asia, China. Similar effects to what the lockdowns in China are doing now. 2005, Hurricane Katrina. Louisiana, the Gulf Coast in North America is a major source for petrochemicals globally. And so supply chains, people reliant on commodities coming out of that region, severely disrupted. 2011. So I worked in the automotive industry in the automotive coatings prior to this. And what I was told by my friends in the coatings industry is at the time, cars with very bright mica sparkle in the paint was very popular. So very, very sparkly metallic colours. Now that relied on a particular large particle mica pigment that came from one factory, and that all the car companies were using this pigment and had been formulated into dozens of top coats for paint, and that one factory was in Fukushima. And so suddenly around the world, all those colours had to be reformulated, and we can't supply those colours anymore because we can't get this critical ingredient. 2017, not many of you have been affected, but those who were affected badly. Hanjin Shipping, one of the major global shipping companies, suddenly went into liquidation. Ships around the world were impounded with their containers on them. And obviously we had the Ever Given issue last year where it blocked the Suez Canal. We had a trade war with China and the US in 2018. We've got Brexit, and basically the Tories in the UK have been given a massive lead pass on Brexit by COVID, because if it wasn't for COVID, people would actually have seen Brexit for the unmitigated disaster that it's been, because it's having a massive impact on trade between Europe and the UK, and a lot of companies in Europe are just saying, well, it's just too hard to deal with the UK. We'll forget about the UK now. And so it is really affecting the UK. And as the pandemic recedes, I think the impacts will become more obvious. And of course, who would have thought? We've got Ukraine, which is a major source of food products, major source of energy, major source of things like nickel, suddenly involved in a war and basically taken offline. And, you know, I've just come back from 5 weeks in visiting clients and doing marketing our business in Europe. And the issue that's been discovered is that not many people that I dealt with were sourcing product directly from Ukraine, but a lot of them were sourcing product from Poland, and a lot of those Polish companies were sourcing inputs from Ukraine. And so the disruption further up the supply chain. So the reality is supply chain disruption, and that study with McKinsey, actually, when you reflect on it, makes a lot of sense. And it is what we're seeing. So what McKinsey said is that a major supply chain disruption was one that took you offline for a month. So what would it mean if you're offline for a critical input for a month? So how many months or years does it take when you're unable to sell your product because you can't supply it, because you can't get a critical input? How long does it take? So how long does it take to make up the lost profit margin? We're talking about the gross margin on the product that we're losing because we can't supply. And I did a rough back of the envelope calculation on this. So I said, let's take a product that we're selling and we're generating $200,000 a month revenue, and we're making a 50% gross margin, because it's the gross margin that matters here, because our fixed costs are staying the same. If we're out of stock for a month, we've lost, therefore, $200,000 in revenue. So we can't supply for a month because of a supply chain issue, and $100,000 in gross margin. Now, let's say the thing that we ran out of was actually 20% of the cost of goods. So it's a pretty important input. So it's 20% of the cost of goods, but it's not 100% of the cost of goods. But without it, we can't supply anything. That's not again, I don't think that's an unrealistic scenario. And so we're spending 20% of the cost of goods, 20% of 100,000. We're spending $20,000 a year on that, $20,000 a month on that item. So if we looked at the total cost of sourcing that item from wherever we've sourced it, China or Bangladesh or whatever low-cost country we've gone to, because I'm assuming that's what we've done, and we were saving, and we looked at the total cost savings. So we took into account freight, we took into account inventory holding costs, we took into account cost of poor quality, all these factors, then realistically, we're probably saving about 25%. So my experience, we say if we got a 50% ex-work saving, and we're actually making a 25% net total cost of goods saving, we're probably doing quite well. So that means we're saving $5,000 a month, which means it's going to take us 20 months to make up the loss that we had from 1 month of lost supply. And obviously you could change these numbers and you could talk about years of lost supply. If the outage is longer than a month, again, it multiplies. It's another 20 months. So thanks, Frank. So the reality is that there is an economic cost to this kind of disruption, and it multiplies very, very quickly indeed, because of our long and vulnerable supply chains. What drives supply chain risk? What are the factors that drive supply chain risk? And the most obvious and the most significant driver of supply chain risk, and if you're into doing, safety stock calculations and whatever, the most significant driver of inventory is lead time. The longer it takes to get here, the further it travels, the greater the chance of something goes wrong. But we just ignored that. We just buried our heads in the sand. Yes, it takes 4 months to get here. Yes, it's going from, Chongqing through on a second-rate truck to Shanghai, and it's sitting here, and then it's going to Singapore, and then it's being cross-docked, and then it's going here. But yeah, it'll be all right. It's cheap, saving money, So replenishment lead time, it's both in terms of the length of the supply chain, so the number of steps, so number of opportunities for something to go wrong, and the duration of time. So if we say we could do the statistics, if there's a major disruption every 3.5 7 years, and we've got, as some people I know sourcing out of South Asia were putting up with before COVID, a 6-month lead time. Well, there's a 1 in 8 chance that during that 6-month lead time for any given order, we'll have a major supply chain disruption. That's pretty short odds, I would think. So lead time is the most important factor driving supply chain risk. The other one is replenishment interval. So this is the frequency at which we purchase. So this is exactly the same demand data for the same item. I actually just generated it randomly, but I aggregated it into monthly buckets and then weekly buckets. And you can see if we're at monthly buckets, we're averaging about, actually I can use the laser here, we're averaging 12 units a month sales. But the fluctuation is from 1 up to 18. But if we do it weekly, exactly the same input data, we're averaging around 3 units a week, and the fluctuation is from 0 to 5. So what the implication of that is that if I order based on this and I get this, I'm in big trouble. And if I'm expecting, you know, the average and I get this, I'm also in big trouble. Whereas if I'm ordering here, then the amount of variation I'm trying to manage is much less. So often the standard deviation of these numbers is how we calculate stock, and obviously the standard deviation of this scenario is much greater than here. The other factor is if I'm ordering every month, or if I'm ordering every 3 months, as I see a lot of companies do, because I want to order a full container lot and I'm going to get a great discount, or I'm ordering every 6 months, then the risk of, you know, the multiplier effect here is even greater, because if that one order that's only coming every 3 months is delayed, then the chances are I'm going to run out. Whereas if I'm ordering every week, then chances are I've only got another week before the next delivery comes, and I should be right.
You're very handsome. Do I have time for
So reducing you know, if we're ordering 3 monthly going to monthly, if we're ordering monthly going to weekly or fortnightly, is another key driver to reduce our supply chain risk.
Be helpful.
I'll see how I go.
Love you.
Now, the obvious counterpoint to that is to say, oh, but what about the freight? And I think that just requires some clever thinking. So first of all, our inventory in this scenario is going to be much, much lower. Secondly, when we look at things like freight, first of all, we can use consolidation centres and bring multiple suppliers together to consolidate in full containers. We can look at 20-footers. Often if we look at the true cost of ownership, sometimes smaller containers or even buying LCL in single pallets can stack up. We did a lot of work with a company in the UK that was importing from all over the world. We found a lot of items that was actually economic, more economic because of the inventory cost, holding cost, to actually buy them in single pallets rather than buy full containers. So it just needs some creative thinking in a lot of cases to reduce the inventory. The other thing is source company risk, and I've deliberately chosen this picture because when people think of risky countries, they think of, say, well, obviously Ukraine, they think of China at the moment. They think, where could I go that's low cost and stable? Thailand, you know, Thailand. So the perception of Thailand is it's a nice, stable, safe place to manufacture. And it is. It's got a great manufacturing culture built by having a big Japanese-run automotive industry, so you get good quality people in Thailand. It's a good manufacturing culture. But there is a massive, still unresolved, civil conflict within Thailand. This is Thailand, Bangkok International Airport during the Yellow Shirts protest. You know, a short time before, you could take the same photo and it would have been a sea of red with the Red Shirts protest. And so Thailand has underlying tensions. It's got a military government. You know, things could go off in Thailand. But everybody would regard Thailand as a pretty safe place to source and relatively low risk. Well, it's not. Another thing is the robustness of logistics and supply chain. I actually did a presentation similar to this to a group of companies around the world a few months ago, and I did a presentation looking at the relative risk profile of different countries, looking at, say, their transparency, international corruption rating, and all these other factors. And I then got questions saying at the end of it, so what do you think about Vietnam? What do you think about Bangladesh? You know, I said to Vietnam, well, you want to get out of China, don't you? So you want to get out of a corrupt, authoritarian, communist country without a rule of law. That's a good idea. Let's go to Thailand. What's Thailand? It's exactly the same. So, sorry, Vietnam, sorry, exactly the same. And so the issue as well is often the internal logistics within these countries is very poor. This is Vietnam. But if you're looking at shipping goods from inland China, so the approach in Australia in particular, especially in Australia, was when things started getting expensive in China, if I go back to 2017, 2018, whereas the Northern Hemisphere were looking at bringing supply chains closer, and you heard the term reshoring, in Australia, we just drove our heads further into the sand and doubled down on our China sourcing and looked for inland suppliers and cheaper suppliers and worse suppliers. And, you know, I know companies that were importing metal fabricated assemblies from China, and they had rework departments where they had a little team of people whose job was to fix up the defects in the goods they were sourcing from China, in the metal welded assemblies they were sourcing from China. You know, and some of the welding was like stuff you would get in, you know, for year 7 metal work, you know. And so often the supply chains internally within these countries are not robust. You know, and I say China is probably the best of them, but it's, you know, if you look at getting goods from inland China, Chengdu, Chongqing, Wuhan, to the coast, it's challenging. Another thing is diversity of supply. Now, people would say, well, isn't lean thinking about having one source? Well, no, because one source puts you at great vulnerability, like our Fukushima pigment example. So the question is then, how do we have multiple sources? So we don't want to be, and this is where the chickens are coming home to roost to a lot of companies, we don't want to be playing games with our suppliers. We don't want to be placing an order with you today and you tomorrow and chopping and changing and so forth. We want to give our suppliers some level of commitment. But we also don't want to place our business at a strategic risk because we're reliant on a single supplier and a single source of supply. So the best way to do it is to look at your what you source of a particular commodity and say, well, I've got a major supplier, I'll source these items from this supplier, but I'll have another supplier where I'll source some other items. So specific part numbers, I'm going to source from particular suppliers. And I know I'll give the second supplier enough to keep them interested. And I will also know that they've got the capability to ramp up if they fail. We did that many years ago with a big sheet metal sourcing project. We had 2 suppliers in Australia in this case. One had about 60% of the work, one had about 40% of the work. The one that had 60% of the work went into administration. And so we were able to switch the work over. If we'd sole sourced it, we would have been in enormous trouble. What kind of steps do you need to take to reduce your risk? The first thing is long-term thinking. So the good news is that I probably visited a dozen factories and I met a couple of hundred people at trade shows in 5 weeks in Europe, and I asked many of them about their supply chain situation, and most of them talked about it in the past tense. So some of them, a handful, were affected by Ukraine, but in terms of the broader disruption on, you know, commodities, most of the, you know, things like computer chips and steel and all those things that we've heard about being in incredible short supply, most of the people I spoke to in Europe were talking about that, yeah, we did have that problem last year, or yeah, we did have that. Now what they're saying is my warehouses are full to the roof. And so I've actually don't think I'll be ordering anything for the next 3 months. So that in effect will have, you know, suddenly that's going to happen all around the world. Everyone's going to be stocked up. And then for key commodities, demand will stop. And that will create another fluctuation, because then supply will get turned back down again, demand will tighten, and we'll get another shortage. So this is called the bullwhip effect. We'll get these wild fluctuations. And I think we've got at least 2 years of that. So we've got to think out. So yes, suddenly I've got everything I need. I'm just going to go and put my head back in the sand, just go back to business as usual. Everything's going to be sweet. No. We're looking at a couple of years of disruption. So then we've got to do that, we've got to then understand our extended value stream. So we've got to identify what are the things within our business that are critical inputs. What are the things that if we don't have them, they could stop us? And therefore, what are the strategies we're going to put in place to protect those inputs? So the first thing is, if they could stop us, are they vulnerable? So, you know, if I've got something like I'm making glass and I'm getting silica sand from my truck from 20 kilometres down the road, I'm pretty safe for that, aren't I? If I'm making...
It just hit me on last night.
Sorry? If I'm... but if I'm, say, looking at it as a customer of ours, I'm a critical input to my product is LCD computer screens, then, and if I don't have those, I can't supply the product, then I need to really have a strategy for that. I need to look at what are the risks in that supply chain. And even though, let's say my supplier might be in Australia, where are they getting their inputs from and where's the vulnerability for them? And so by looking at what's critical and what's vulnerable, I can then identify where I've got to focus and develop a strategy. And the kind of strategies might be reducing your lead time. So particularly what we're seeing is vertical integration, more than people going from an offshore supplier to a local supplier, people going from an offshore supplier to bringing it in-house. And so that's driven partly by supply chain risk, partly by the fact that technology is changing. So many of the upstream technologies, particularly in metal manufacturing, are becoming a lot more accessible. So you don't need a skilled tradesman to run a machine tool anymore. You don't need a skilled tradesman to run sheet metal fabrication equipment if you want to make your own enclosures. It's also driven by the fact that suddenly if I've got all these resources under my control, I can develop a pretty flexible operation. I can respond really quickly because I can build something from scratch very quickly with a short lead time. And so it's about bringing the means of production closer to the customer. So there's a number of drivers to this. With onshoring, the other thing that's happening is people are looking at not so much saying their existing product range, I'm going to bring that onshore that I'm currently sourcing offshore. It's more like as my product development wheel turns and I introduce new products, I'll look to bring those products back onshore. So the next generation of products, I will design them from the ground up on the basis that I'm going to source, I'm going to eliminate my vulnerable supply chain. And the other thing that's happening more in Europe, again, we've had our heads buried in the sand, sorry to say it, is there's been a huge move going on from China to Poland, Turkey, Eastern Europe generally. There's been a huge move going on in the States, obviously, from China back to Mexico and also to the southern US where the costs are quite low. And in fact, I've seen some analysis from Boston Consulting that total cost of ownership for sourcing something out of the southern states of the US versus China is it's probably cheaper to get it out of the US if you're in the US. The other thing is buying smaller frequencies more often. I've talked about that. And also building longer term relationships with suppliers. So again, there's a natural power relationship between a supplier and a buyer. And frankly, a lot of us get off on it. I'm the customer. I'll tell you what you have to do and when you have to do it. Well, you know, if we've had that approach or we've chopped and changed suppliers, taken the trading approach, well, good luck now. You know, good luck when times are hard. And so what we need to do is think of our suppliers more long term. Now, especially those of you who are in small or medium-sized enterprise, often SMEs, in my experience, don't focus on building long-term supply relationships. I'll talk to an SME and they'll say, oh, we've bought from XYZ for the last 20 years. But then I'll go and talk to the supplier and they'll say, oh, yeah, they do occasionally buy things from us. We haven't had Bob, did we get a purchase order from so-and-so last week? No. Yeah, I don't know when they're going to order next. So our perception is that we've got a wonderful long-term relationship with this supplier. Their perception is that you're just another customer who orders from time to time. So we want to build service level agreements that act like basically a procedure for how we do business. So we're not just talking about supply contracts around pricing and so forth. We're talking about a understanding about how we're going to place orders, how they're going to deliver, and how we're going to work together. And giving the supplier a longer term certainty of demand. So the example of our client who buys computer screens, they sat down with Omron. Omron said, what do you think you'll buy in the next 12 months? Customer said 300 screens is what we think we'll buy. And so Omron are then planning to supply over 12 months to supply this customer 300 screens. Now there's no firm commitment that they're going to buy 300 screens, but even if there was, you know, under the current circumstances, that may not be a bad strategy, provided you didn't get them all on day one, which is a lot of people have done that. They've gone and bought 12 months demand at once. And then it's cool, it's okay, and this is one of the, again, misnomers of about lean and just in time. It's okay to have strategic stock to where we've got known vulnerabilities, particularly if we've got a low value item that we know if we run out, we can't supply, well, have some more stock of it. Now, unfortunately, because the media is generally ignorant about most things, you hear and I've even read it in stuff written by one of the big four accounting firms. Oh, well, you know, so companies are moving, it was in Company Director, that's right, moving from just in time to just in case. Well, you're telling me that sourcing goods from China on a 16-week lead time was ever just in time? That was never just in time. Just in time was never about that. And just in time is never about having less stock than you need. It's about having the right stock, exactly the right stock at the right time in the right place. But at the moment, we might make a decision that we know, okay, how long do we think we could be out of stock for? How would that affect us? And therefore, how much extra buffer stock do we need to hold as a contingency? So the reality is something's got to give. A lot of purchasing people are really procurement people. It's all about cost of goods, price, unit price. Well, unit price is likely to go up. But if we're out of stock for a month and can't sell our product at all because we can't get the product from some weird location where our purchasing officer's got the deal of the century, or because the massive container one-off deal, special deal we got has been held up at, you know, in the Panama Canal or in the Suez Canal when there's a ship stuck in it, then how much does that loss of sales and gross margin cost our business? And I'd argue that will wipe out years of savings very quickly. The reality is that the extra cost of the unit cost of the items we're buying is often overcome by clever thinking. So creating ordering routines that make it simpler for the supplier to supply may mean that they don't charge you more, in fact. Improving product design to take cost out that way, using a bit of lean thinking to create a more flexible organisation that can leverage that shorter supply chain to provide better service to customers. So if we're able to shorten our lead time, increase our flexibility, we can be more agile to provide better service to customers. We can't do that if we're importing our goods from overseas on a 16-week lead time or a 20-week lead time or whatever it is. And obviously applying lean thinking. So that's, I don't know how I went for time there, but yeah, so any questions, comments? Frank? Is that we've got question time? We go straight in the panel?
I think we might just go into the panel, then we'll do questions after. I know because Wayne has to get away by 9:30. So thanks for that, Tim. That's great. So a lot of points there to think about how you run your business. I think I've heard a story, the local manufacturer, I won't mention who they are, but they pretty well outsource everything to China. And then obviously with COVID, had a whole lot of issues. And they, I've got to get my mic. I keep forgetting about the mic. Sorry to those people online. I'll start again. A classic example of, when you're pressured, you can actually do something about fixing it. So this company, was making a component overseas because it was cheaper, and they pretty well shut down their operations except for sales. COVID's come along, and next thing you know, they're making the product back here in the country at the same cost as what they were getting from overseas. So when you're forced to do something, you can do. So Tim's point about being a little bit, bury your head in the sand, sort of not laziness, but it's just an easy way out from my perspective. When you really have to find a way of doing it, you can do it, but it's not easy. All right, look, we'll get on to the panel discussion. So I'd just get a couple of seats out here. So I've asked, I actually asked 3 people to come along today, and unfortunately one of them couldn't come. So I've got Wayne Dix here who's the CEO of Trimpac, and Andrew Borg is a supply chain director of sales food, Mars Food. I did have Keith Queenie, who's the APAC logistics manager of FMC Corporation. We're based in Wyong, but unfortunately he had to take a call in the US this morning, so he had to pull out at the last minute. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and we'll get the ball rolling from the question point of view with the panelists, and then we'll also seek some questions from both online and in the room here. So I'll start with you, Wayne, and the question will be the same question for you too, Andrew. But maybe you can tell us briefly about your business and what you do, and then tell us about the kind of supply chain challenges you've faced in the past 2 years and how you've responded to those.
Okay. So Trimpac is a contracting manufacturing business based on the Central Coast. We supply personal care and household cleaning products to the major supermarkets. Been in business since 1963. So looking at the presentation of Tim and thinking about the possible questions that may come from the panel, I think on reflection on the challenges that we've had, the only certainty that we have is that we have uncertainty. And there's a lot of things that one can look at doing in the supply chain. But I think on reflection on what we did going 2.5 years back was we focused a lot of time on our relationships. Key thing was to establish or leverage off those good relationships that we had. I think the comments that Tim made around having our heads in the ground, I think a lot of our focus was on our people and helping our people transition through the change, because there was a known set of circumstances and our people get involved in day-to-day routine. So I think what we did a lot was spend a lot of time in identifying that early, how we can actually assist our people in getting comfortable with feeling uncertain and as well vulnerability. And what we saw happen was we started problem solving. And through those good relationships with our suppliers and customers, we were able through that period actually get through it quite well. So a lot of focus on the core principles of supply chain, but we actually had to go to the impact of our people. And we put our people first in the organization. We actually put out a communication around, we will look after your safety, your health. Through that, gave that confidence to the people that we had the backing of the company, but then also that helped, I think, help us problem solving with our suppliers and customers. And we leveraged off, I think, good relationships with the customers. So we didn't scramble, and so we got to change. We said, well, we've got the relationships with the customers, how do we leverage the best of them?
So Mars Food is a local manufacturing business, part of the Mars Inc. group. So you're probably aware of some of the brands like Master Foods, Dolmio, Canton, Ben's Original. So about 300 associates working here on the coast. We've been manufacturing on the coast for about 30 years, so pretty embedded in the local community. And a lot of similar topics. So obviously for us, people is a big one. So that initial kind of, when that change was happening and helping people understand the change and what we were going to do differently. I think for us, what we saw initially was, really significant panic buying. So a lot of our categories cover, some of those topics or some of those areas of the supermarket aisles that were very heavily shopped when there was lots of uncertainty, when the public was sort of, shopping the toilet paper rolls, if you remember those challenges, but also lots of, pasta and rice and those sort of staple products. So for us, we saw unprecedented demand through that period of panic buying, which meant that it put significant strain across our local factory as well as our local supply chains. And I think the benefit for us was that, fortunately, 95% of our products are actually produced here within Australia. So that really helped us. But what it did mean was that lots of our raw materials and packaging were coming from overseas. And so what we found very quickly was, with lots of shipping constraints, but also trying to help our suppliers. So a lot of our ingredients in particular are coming from places like India, where they're sourced from very fragmented supply chains. So they're, if you think of some of our products, they might be herbs and spices. Some of those materials are farmed in India with 30 local farmers who are producing that particular herb. So trying to get from our supplier to help them through the supply chain, to help their suppliers, was one of the critical things that we had to work on. And again, as the guys have touched on around, those relationships were really critical. So I think we were really fortunate in the sense that we've had really strong relationships with our customers as well as our suppliers for a long time. So, to Tim's point earlier, when you're able to leverage that relationship to help you, that certainly makes a difference. But certainly global shipping was probably our biggest constraint, just given the network and what was happening across, the shipping network across the world. If you look at some of the imagery at the moment, where you see it's still lots of congestion out of key ports, whether it's in Asia or North America and Europe. So that were probably some of the critical ones.
You've answered my second question, which is good. So what's the future looking like then? So obviously you've put things in place. Are these things going to stick for the future? So just get your thoughts on that.
I think, as Tim has said, there's uncertainty for at least the next 2 years. I think understanding one's contribution to the supply chain and understanding your contribution, as well as where your customer sits in that supply chain, is pretty important. And also understanding the value that you contribute to the supply chain. So I think a lot of focus on data, understanding data transparency within the supply chain. I think in the past, possibly certain assumptions were made. Test those assumptions, understand those vulnerabilities. And I think also, Frank, we spoke about earlier, price. And I think, reflecting on price and the impact that we've seen now, we've seen the last 12 months, manufacturing input inflation around about 14%. And there's a lot of pressure on us now in terms of price and the input costs, is to maybe, as manufacturers and participants in the supply chain, understand the value that we bring. And when we're looking at price negotiation discussion with our customers, let's make sure we actually look at value, our value to that supply chain, and make sure that we're actually looking at value going forward, rather than having just the focus on price and getting the costs down. So look at the value we contribute.
Yeah, I think something that was definitely changed for us and will continue in the future is the mode of sourcing that we're using. So definitely where we've had the ability to, we've switched to much more local sourcing where that's possible, as well as validating other sources of supply. So again, very key topics that Tim's touched on around, we've had trusted suppliers for a long time, but how do we make sure that we're spreading that across more options to make sure that we're securing our supply chain? So that's definitely one. I think, data is another one, obviously, that Wayne's been touching on as well, as far as we generate lots of data and we have lots of data, but how do we use that data and how are we using that data to help us with the visibility longer term and to be able to make quick, agile decisions as well? Because often we've got all this data that's available to us, we just don't know what to do with it. So how do we make sure that we're using that to help us and help us in the long term? And then I think the other one that we've really recognized is labor and people. So I think supply chain traditionally has been one of those areas where people have just sort of fallen into supply chain. They haven't necessarily come through with the right skills and experiences. So we definitely see that there's a big opportunity for us to build that capability within our own business, but also within the industry as well. I think that's really important. So I think, supply chain will definitely be the rock stars of the future, given the amount of media that they're getting at the moment and the desire to want to be in sort of those, ever evolving and agile sort of situations and areas of the business. So I think people will be a really big part of, what we want to do in the future moving forward and how we grow that locally. And we're seeing that whether that's through our warehousing and logistics, recruiting, or whether that's through our factory operations, or whether it's through sort of office-based supply chain roles is really important. So it's a really tough labour market, I think. So if you've got the right skills and the right experiences, it's definitely, there's lots of opportunity in this space. So how do we attract new talent into this area of our businesses for the future? It'd be really important.
One question for you, Andrew. I just wanted to know how you leverage, you're a global organisation, so how did you leverage that in terms of being able to secure your supply chain?
So as I said, locally, 95% of our stuff is produced here in Australia. So that was definitely a big tick for us. I think with the global opportunity as far as being a bigger business, it's helped us leverage lots of other relationships as far as unlocking ability with whether it's shipping lines, whether it's with really key suppliers. So that certainly helped. I think what it also made us do is reflect what we're doing regionally in Australia. Is that best practice? And is there stuff that we should be, recognising and stealing with pride from other regions or other segments within our business that we could be doing things better? Because I think, the pace was phenomenal. And so I think always having come in or having been in the FMCG industry, we always move really quickly, or we thought we did. But the last 2 years has just shown that it's kind of warped that speed up completely. So, that best practice and what we can do to continue to get better.
All right, I think we'll open up to questions. I've got a few here online. So, yeah, I'll give you a seat, Jim. Sit here and... Oops, lost my thing here. All good. Okay, I've got a question here from Leanne Faulkner. Good morning, Leanne. Thinking of very small manufacturers, how can we balance proactive supply chain management with very tight, often squeezed cash flow management? So I'll start with you, Tim.
Is that if you look at the history of lean or the Toyota production system, that's where it was born. So in the 1950s, Toyota was a small car company with major cash flow issues. So they got very good at working hand to mouth would be the term. Only having exactly what they needed, when they needed it, in the quantity that they needed it, which was the basis of just in time. And they then institutionalised that. So I think, so as a small organisation, that's one of those things, is buy less more frequently is okay. And the point I made earlier is that, if you look at your business functionally and you look at the purchasing function, then you're totally focused on the purchase price of goods. But if you look at your business holistically and look at the profit and loss and the balance sheet, then paying a little bit extra for goods so I can buy less more often, even though it might take a little bit of my margin, overall it's going to give me more flexibility and allow me to build that growth. So I think it's about taking that holistic view and recognising that learning how to work hand to mouth is not an altogether bad thing at all.
Okay, and look, one of the things I've seen, talking to a few manufacturers and also speaking to some of the guys in our entrepreneurs program, a lot of businesses have been buying up a lot of stock, because they're frightened that there's going to be more shortages, but of course that's going to create a cash flow problem, right? They probably hadn't budgeted for holding, an extra 6 months worth of stock or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a problem. It's just about I would believe, be ready to rear its head.
Yeah. But they're spending a lot of time at work because they can't get in the front door for all the toilet paper they bought.
That's right.
So it's the same mentality.
Yeah. Do you guys have any comments on that?
I think maybe to touch on one aspect is when utilising cash flow, look at where your vulnerabilities are, and then maybe extend certain cash flow to those vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Second question from Steve O'Keefe. Will local sovereign sourcing continue long term, or will overseas sourcing creep back into reduce costs?
Maybe start with Andrew.
So I think there's definitely going to be a lot more remaining local. I think a lot of us have learned that there is definitely value to be found locally. It's just a matter of building those relationships and making sure that they're sustainable long term for those supply partners. I think there will be a bit of a rebalance though. I think people will still consider what is best for their supply chains and what does that look like. But I definitely think that local sourcing is definitely going to continue to increase, and what it probably has driven is the need or the visibility created of where there's gaps within the Australian infrastructure, but also within the Australian market for opportunists or entrepreneurs to be able to come in and fill that space as well. So I think where we can, absolutely, we should be supporting the local opportunities.
I can comment on that too.
Oh, you've got your own
I got my own mic. Yeah, sorry. I'll be on stereo. I think in terms of, I think the answer is that most of the changes will be permanent, which is pretty much what you said, Andrew. I do get a sense of people still saying, oh, well, that's all over, let's go back to normal. Again, especially here, because for all our strength in Australia, we are a very complacent nation, mainly because I think our markets are not as competitive as markets in the Northern Hemisphere, so we're not perhaps on our toes as much as we would be if we're trying to compete in the UK or US, where competition is more intense. But I think that the COVID has really just accelerated a trend that was already well underway. When I first started doing projects in China, which was in about 2003, I think 2004, the wage for a welder was about $300 US, $200 US a day, a month, sorry. That same welder is now being paid more than $1,000 US a month. So the costs of supply and as I said in my presentation, what I saw some companies in Australia doing was, rather than realizing that suddenly and your example was a good one, their Chinese source was now just as expensive as a local source. So rather than sort of see that as a bit of a message, they instead tried to double down by finding the supplier in the middle of nowhere, operating on a dirt floor with really poor controls and whatever, poor governance. And so I think people hopefully will have learned their lesson about that. Not everyone, and some people are probably, it's back to Groundhog Day. But I think that overall people will be learning their lesson. And hopefully people will be seeing the opportunities that having a shorter supply chain presents. So I can customize my product. I can offer a bigger product range. I maybe don't need to hold finished goods stock. That all of these things might suddenly make people rethink what they can do. I can introduce products because I've got now brought certain capabilities in-house through vertical integration. I can now introduce products that I couldn't do before, this kind of thing.
Okay, I just lost my connection. Don't know why. I think there was, anyway. Any questions from the floor here? Anyone?
I think you've broadly touched on it, but I suppose I'm just interested. It sort of strikes me that it's actually as much a good opportunity or excuse to accelerate the onshoring process, and essentially, I suppose, good for economic growth and development. But I suppose I'm interested in where the major challenges that lie with that sort of stem from. Obviously, labour, I think, was mentioned as one, infrastructure potentially another, and I suppose how can we, or what sort of thinking is there as to how we could go about building those connections and focusing on how we can deliver some of those solutions more in the broader context.
Maybe someone else go first, yeah?
I think we've touched on it a bit earlier, but the opportunity that exists in actually developing people skill sets. So, where we possibly had complacency in the environment before is to go and understand the value we contribute and then go and look at the great opportunity is that what we're doing now, we'll need a different set of skill sets in the future. So how do we actually identify those skill sets and invest in those people? So that's a great opportunity, I think, going forward.
I think one of the other ones for us, obviously we've touched on people and infrastructure, but I think Australia is pretty, let's call it dynamic when it comes to weather. So from a business that's producing food, the stability of our weather can be a challenge when it comes to whether it's flooding, bushfires, extreme droughts. So there's been lots of progress made within agricultural space, and I think that's just going to continue to happen. I think for us, the challenge just becomes making it in scale and making it viable for farmers and agriculturalists to be investing in that space. But I definitely think there's more opportunity for us, to continue sourcing locally when it comes to the ability to grow food.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, and I'll take a different angle, if we look at it strategically, we've got a lot of missing links in the supply chain now that will act as barriers to that. It's particularly when, again, having freshly come back from Europe and stood at trade shows and talked to people and realising what they're doing over there. So a good example, when I first started manufacturing in Victoria, there were 4 tyre plants in Melbourne. I think there was 1 in Adelaide and 1 in Sydney. Now there's no tyre manufacturing in Australia, because not only were there 4 tyre plants, but there was a carbon black plant, there was a synthetic rubber plant, and there was BHP used to make wire for retreads. Now, no investment was put into those plants because, they were small and because of they were local market only. And so gradually that whole supply chain collapsed. So if you ever wanted to build tyres again in Australia, you'd be importing all your inputs from overseas, and why would you do that? So that's one example. And but I think there's a role for government in terms of helping develop those supply chains that have the most potential to fill in those missing links and make sure that we've got the infrastructure and we can develop clusters where we've got capabilities around the various inputs, and as well around things like R&D and university research that's providing that overall ecosystem for businesses in that sector to thrive. And so I think that's one of the barriers. If you look at casting, particularly die casting, there's very little. If you want to buy a die cast, aluminium die cast, high pressure die cast component in Australia, you've got limited choices. Whereas you go to China, not only are there lots and lots of choices, but they're really, really good at it. And there's tooling and there's machine makers and there's the whole infrastructure there around doing really good high pressure die casting. Now that still exists in Europe. It's kind of lost here. And so there's gaps that have opened up on the supply chain that I think are going to be hopefully gradually rebuilt, but need to be rebuilt for those supply chains to be truly competitive. Because we don't just compete at one level on the supply chain. We compete on whole supply chains. And this is the advantage that somewhat like the food industry has. So many of Andrew's inputs are ultimately coming locally, that it makes sense to be, and what Andrew hasn't mentioned is Mars is a fantastic exporter of food, of highly processed food products around the region. And so that's built on a supply chain, a whole supply chain that exists here. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we might just leave it there. Just gone past 9:35. So I think David Ward had a question. David, I'll get back to you on that one. I might have to bring you up together because I can't see it on my screen now. Don't know what's happening.
Frank, can I just make one quick thing? Is those of you who are online, I think we've got the details of those who are here, but those who are online, if they want a copy of the presentation, let us have the details and we'll send them the copy of the presentation.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, would you like to put your hands together for Andrew, Wayne and Tim?